Bonjour, good afternoon. My name is Adele Blackett. I am a professor of law and Canada Research Chair in Transnational Labour Law and Development here at McGill University, and I am pleased to welcome you on this long-awaited start of spring in Montreal to the 9th session of our bilingual course commemorating the ILO's centenary, entitled Transnational Futures of International Labour Law, la justice sociale dans le monde du travail. This commemorative course is sponsored through the 2016 Fellowship of the nonpartisan Pierre-Elliott-Trudeau Foundation. As I do habitually, I wish to acknowledge that we are on the traditional, unceded land of members of the Haudenosaunee Confederation, lands that have served as a meeting ground for several Indigenous nations, including the Anishinaabe. The acknowledgement has special significance today, because worldwide it is the International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. We are honored to be able to commemorate this date with a guest lecture by one of the world's leading experts and lifelong advocate for racial equality, Gay McDougall. Before I proceed to frame today's session and to introduce our distinguished guest, please allow me first to acknowledge that there are, or will be, several leading Montreal pathfinders in the struggle for racial equality in this room. I want to extend my gratefulness for your presence here today. Second, I'd like to turn the podium over to someone who has been purposefully making a significant difference here at McGill University, Associate Provost, Equity and Academic Policies, and Professor of Law, Angela Campbell, and she has offered to say a few words of welcome. So thank you very much.
So good afternoon, bonjour à tous et à toutes. It is truly an honor for me to be here in the faculty, which is my home, and I am away for a little while in the James Administration Building on a secondment where my portfolio is equity and academic policies. But I'm delighted to be here, particularly in the context of this course that's been offered by my colleague, Professor Adele Blackett, which is truly innovative, this course on transnational futures of labor law. And I'm especially glad to be here today as we have the honor of hosting on our campus a most notable leader and jurist, Gay McDougall, whose work has been truly transformative in the domains of international human rights law and racial discrimination. I note especially the importance of her presence today, given her role as Vice Chair of the UN Committee on the Elimination of Race Discrimination, so noteworthy, as Professor Blackett mentioned, as we today recognize the UN International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. So I'd like to take a minute, if I could, to talk a little bit about what I have learned and what I am learning about race discrimination since taking up my role as Associate Provost at McGill, whose brief includes oversight of equity initiatives and the advancement of equity on our campuses. I want to say three things. So the first is that I have realized that there is a sharp, ongoing denial about racism and discrimination in other forms. And it continues, and it takes shape in a multitude of ways. So it can be insidious and subtle, but it also can be direct and violent. So I don't mean that to be kind of negative or extremely down about things, but it exists, and it can be extremely difficult when we hear and continue to hear that there isn't discrimination, particularly in a university which is viewed as the epitome of a meritocracy, but it is wrong and unhelpful I think, to deny the ongoing persistence of discrimination, including race discrimination. Second, the impact of race discrimination is deep and harmful. And I would say that while there is enormous resilience within the human spirit, discrimination over a lifetime, over years, even when subtle, unintended, or indirect, can have big effects. It can impact how someone fares in their job, in their studies, in their economic wellness, and their overall sense of belonging and wellness, and I think we need to talk about that. In these conversations, I have realized, and I actually have to say that I realized that I was in kind of a bubble here in the law faculty in many ways, and I'm learning many things, but these conversations are difficult and they make people really uncomfortable, and people don't like to have them very often, but they're critical to moving forward. As a non-racialized person, I think I have some role to play. That is, it's not the job of racialized people alone to recognize, name, and fight racism. But there's a lot to be said about being present with as much humility as one can muster, primarily to learn rather than to teach, to listen instead of speaking all the time, to follow and support rather than to lead, and to being open to the possibility of being wrong, and to changing our ways of seeing, thinking, and doing rather than insisting on being right. So I'm still learning, and my sense, though, is that these principles are an important start to doing right in the work to prevent and fight racial discrimination. So I want to thank you all, and thank, in particular, Ms. McDougall, Professor Blackett, for giving me a little bit of time to say these brief remarks, especially today, the International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination.
Thank you very much, Professor Campbell. So what does it mean to center a conversation on international labor law and the elimination of racial discrimination? In this ILO centenary, we recall that the ILO's own constitutional annex, the Declaration of Philadelphia of 1944, drafted in Montreal, declares that, and I quote, "All human beings, irrespective of race, creed, or sex, have the right to pursue both their material well-being and their spiritual development in conditions of freedom and dignity, of economic security and equality." We recall that we have just celebrated the 70th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. That declaration declares that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. Similarly, 2018 was the 60th anniversary of the adoption of the ILO's Discrimination, Employment, and Occupation Convention of 1958, number 111. And it was adopted in the middle of the period of decolonization and the historic civil rights movements. And it became an instrument that is now almost universally ratified, 175 states. And as students in this course have read, although Convention 111 prohibits many grounds of discrimination, the Committee of Experts this year decided to devote its general observation for the first time to discrimination based on race, color, and national extraction, and noted that despite long-standing international action against discrimination, including the adoption of the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination that entered into force 50 years ago in 1969, and that acknowledges the UN's condemnation of colonialism, condemns any doctrine of superiority based on racial differentiation, considers and resolves to adopt all necessary measures for the speedy elimination of racial discrimination, despite the Durban Declaration of September 2001 emanating from the World Conference Against Racism, Racial Discrimination, Xenophobia, and Related Intolerance, despite the proclamation of the United Nations General Assembly of the International Decade for People of African Descent from 2015 to 2024, and despite the fact that most countries have prohibited racial discrimination in their laws, racial discrimination persists. It notes with regret, and students in this course have learned to understand that that's really strong language for the Committee of Experts. Far fewer countries have adopted proactive, comprehensive measures aimed at promoting substantive equality in respect of these grounds. They even express concern that in this moment of deepened, dangerous, populist resurgence, there has been an emancipation of hatred that vilifies racial groups, Indigenous peoples, people of African descent, national and religious minorities. And the term race in Convention number 111 does include minority groups whose identity is based on religious characteristics, and they refer to migrants, they refer to intersectional grounds. The committee of experts' observation is brief and by nature general. There is an urgency in attending closely, rigorously, and courageously to the fault line that the founder of modern sociology, W.E.B. Du Bois, framed as the centrality of the color line, and to do so in relation to international labor law. And here I want to point out an aspect of the ILO's history that sometimes gets forgotten, and that Sir Bob Heppel referenced in his 2004 book on labor laws and global trade, when he reminded readers that even the ILO's Credential Committee at one point regularly rejected petitions from South Africa protesting the fact that South African government's exclusive choice of workers' delegates from all white apartheid-era unions was pretty much rejected, and yet that same ILO became the place where, after considerable international pressure, the beginning of the campaign against apartheid emerged when South Africa was forced to withdraw in 1964. And then the ILO was at the forefront of helping South Africa to come back, helping South Africa to reform its laws to redress racial discrimination in work. So I could continue bringing this closer to home and referencing in particular all that we know and that is so well encapsulated by Chief Justice Brian Dixon about why work is such an essential part of people's lives, why it is so much more than the economic, though it is the economic. It's their understanding of their contributions to society, an essential part of their self-work. And so bringing together, insisting on a discussion that, as Associate Provost Campbell mentioned, is so difficult to have, precisely because it matters so much to be able to talk about the persistence of racial discrimination that should have been eliminated in a speedy manner 50, 60, 70 years ago. And to do that through a discussion of the workplace, which is where most people experience their citizenship at work. So this discussion is urgently important, and it is not a coincidence that this much needed conversation, this opportunity to think about the relationship between the United Nations Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, to foster a conversation between all that it has done and what has happened in the context of the International Labor Organization through international labor law, and to ask ourselves how more of these conversations can happen, how we can keep sustained attention on this interface in a moment where we need it tremendously. So we could hardly be more fortunate than to have Gay McDougall, the Vice Chair of the United Nations Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, the former United Nations independent expert on minority rights, with us today. She's currently serving her second term in her position at the United Nations. She is also a distinguished scholar in residence at the Leitner Center for International Law and Justice at Fordham University's School of Law. She earned her JD at Yale Law School. She has an LLM in Public International Law at the London School of Economics and Politics, as well as a BA in Social Science at Bennington College. Her work has consistently challenged inequality. She has worked along the fault lines of race, gender and economic exploitation in the context of the United States and around the world. For 6 years, when she was the UN's independent expert on minority issues, she had the occasion in 2009 to come to Canada. Some of you met her in that context. Most of you know that she prepared a pivotal report in which she chose to focus her attention on persons belonging to racial or ethnic and religious minorities, officially categorized as visible minorities, something that she challenged. It was in her capacity as UN independent expert that I also had the privilege to meet her when she convened a forum in Geneva and took the care to center a focus on minorities and labor, including some of the most marginalized and racialized workers, domestic workers. For 14 years, she was executive director of Global Rights, which worked with human rights advocates in 10 countries around the world to develop their strategies for justice. And prior to that, she played a special role in securing the release of thousands of political prisoners in South Africa and in Namibia. She was then appointed to the Electoral Commission that in 1994 ran the first democratic elections in South Africa that ended apartheid and installed Nelson Mandela as president. Gay McDougall was the recipient of the MacArthur Genius Award for her work in pursuit of global human rights. And in 2015, the government of South Africa bestowed on her the National Medal of Honor for Non-Citizens, the Order of the Companions of O.R. Tambo, for her extraordinary contributions to ending apartheid. She has honorary doctorate in law degrees from 9 universities, including the University of London, the University of Witwatersrand, Emory University, and Georgetown University Law Center. We are incredibly privileged to have you here, Gay McDougall. Please join me in welcoming her to McGill.
Okay, you have to take your notebook.
I will take my notebook.
Well, it's really a pleasure to be here, to be in Canada again. I think I have not been here for 10 years. And to be again with Professor Blanket. I remember learning so much as I went across Canada 10 years ago to examine on behalf of the UN the situation with respect to Canada's meeting its obligations under international law with respect to racial discrimination. So I'm very glad to be here, and I thank you for the invitation and for the honors. On this day in 1960, police opened fire and killed 69 people at a peaceful demonstration against the apartheid pass laws. This took place in Sharpeville, South Africa. This day has been used to commemorate the lives lost in that fight for democracy and equal human rights, and also the sort of way that it propelled the next phase of the fight against apartheid. So, as I do every year, I hope you don't mind me asking that you stand with me for a moment of silence in honoring those who died on that day. And as we think about that massacre, let us think about the fact that it was fueled by the same hatred that led to the mass shootings against other communities of color in their houses of worship. Muslims in a mosque in New Zealand, Sikhs in Oak Creek, Wisconsin, Black Americans in Mother Manuel AME Church in South Carolina, and Jews at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh. Thank you. Thank you. So we've used this day at the UN and encourage people around the world to use this day to commemorate the beginning, in a sense, of a real struggle against racial discrimination, and to evaluate how far we all have met our obligations to ending that kind of marginalization. So I ask that you do that today, as I will also. And of course, I want to start by paying tribute to the role that the ILO played in defeating apartheid. It was a very important role. As one of the major organizations, national organizations, to take that on and to do it for something like 30 years. The ILO was active by passing in 1964, I believe, the conference adopted a declaration against apartheid, and also a program of action or a plan of action that it renewed and refreshed periodically for several years, many years, until 1993, when we were about to move into the elections in South Africa, when the ILO suspended the declaration but would not revoke it until after the following year, after the elections, and they're getting proof that it was leading to positive steps. So I think we all need to start by saying that the ILO, there was a message to all of us around the world that a multilateral international organization such as the ILO felt compelled, and so should we, to take a stand. And I will say that, it really was a sort of shove-off, if you will, of a broader campaign at a different level. It was after Sharpeville that the UN committed itself on drafting an instrument that would be the centerpiece of the global campaign against apartheid and against racism, in spite of, and while noting the important work that was in the ILO Convention 111. And I will talk a little later about what both of those mean and how they interrelate to each other. As the professor has said, we now are celebrating 50 years of the ICERD, as I call it, the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racism, ICERD. So it's been 50 years. And in that time, it has become one of the first and one of the most ratified treaty in the world. It's 195 countries have either ratified or joined as signatories. I think that we are second only to the Convention on the Rights of the Child. For a long time, that had two outstanding ratifications. One was the United States, of course, and one was Somalia, which was in no state to ratify anything. But now it's gotten its act together and it is ratified. So it leaves the U.S. as an outlier yet again. But that is a remarkable number of countries. It's almost every place, except for a few little island nations that, and unfortunately, Myanmar. But what it means is that countries across all sorts of legal systems, all sorts of religious systems, cultural systems, etc., all have said, yes, this is what we believe, that racial discrimination in this form should be outlawed, and that we are pledging ourselves to abide by the terms of the convention as obligations that we take on willingly, and that we pledged to meet. As these international treaties go, there is an international committee of experts that's been set up under it, CERD, Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, to implement the convention, to routinely meet with governments from around the world to test the degree to which they have complied with the terms of the treaty. I was put on this committee in 1997, I believe it was, for a 4-year term. And then I'm now back on for another 4-year term. And I'm, as they say, now trumped. so I won't be for a further 4-year term. But so what I plan to do is I want to describe how CERD works. Then I want to comment on the commonalities and intersections between how we work and what we focused on, and the ILO. I have a few suggestions for future collaborations, which I'm going to test out at some point with people who know the ILO better than I do. But first I thought I just really ought to spend a little time talking about what we have focused on achieving thus far. And then I want to talk about what looms in the future, the present and the future, so that we know what we're dealing with here. Because this is not just about black letter law. We're actually trying to do something that's real and important, and unfortunately gets more so every day. So, past to present. I've often said that the challenge, in my view, of the 20th century, the great challenge of the 20th century, has been to eliminate de jure racism. Racism in law, that is mandated in law. I mean, I was born and grew up in a system like that. I was raised in Georgia in the southern U.S. at a time when we were totally controlled by what we call Jim Crow laws. So it wasn't just that nobody cared about us. It was that they were thinking about us all the time, and they were structuring every aspect of our lives so that they were separate totally, and always, of course, benefited the interest of the dominant white community. But, you know, there are also bigger systems of de jure racism, colonialism, apartheid, several others. But I think it's safe to say that we did eliminate those in the 20th century. And that's, you know, that's quite an achievement. When you think about where we were when I was born, when we think about colonialism, which just ended a minute or two ago, and when we think about apartheid, it was, I think we could say, yeah, okay, you know, we did something real. CERD focused on making sure during this period, the last 50 years, that the legislative frameworks were in place. So not only was there a revocation of any laws that mandated racial separation, but also that there were laws in place that was replaced with laws that said, thou shalt not. And we were very insistent on the new laws looking very much like Article 1 of the ICERD. Now next, so our next accomplishment had to be that while almost every country now has a law that is meant to prohibit discrimination, you know, we're not, in most cases, we're not really totally happy with exactly what it's saying. So for the last 20, 30 years, we've had to focus country by country on trying to get them to use the words, all of the words that are in our convention, which is, I think, a pretty well-written convention, and it very much tracks the ILO 111. It says, well, we've got two parts. One is, you know, who's protected, and the other one is how are their rights impeded. Article 1 says discrimination based on, quote, race, color, descent, or national or ethnic origin. So we're asking that all of those be in the legislation in each country. And we have, through this period, largely because of what we have learned on interaction with other, with governments, we passed a series of what we call general recommendations. These are sort of authoritative interpretations of the convention. Authority because we're the authorities, but it's a way that we clarify what we believe the black letter means. And so we have, over the years, added, through general recommendations, clarifying that even though it doesn't exactly say this, of course it means women in addition to men. You all know how. You got to start there. But also, it means indigenous persons. It means the Roma. It means Dalits. It means non-citizens, migrants. It means African descendants in the diaspora particularly. And it means Muslims facing Islamophobia, or writ more generically, persons whose religious identity is being racialized, and they are persecuted on that basis. So, we stretched it out some. And we're asking that governments also see that as part and parcel of what the black letter really means. Then we decided we had to tackle the definition aspect of Article 1. It's very interesting that there are countries that have written laws and somehow they did not include a definition of discrimination. Our convention says it is, quote, any distinction, exclusion, restriction, or preference based on, all the race, color, blah, 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 which has the purpose or effect of nullifying or impairing the recognition, enjoyment, or exercise on an equal footing of human rights and fundamental freedoms in the political, economic, social, cultural, or any other field of public life. It's really a lot there. And we have worked to help government, civil society understand what's packed in there. Very important, at least to me, is that those words purpose or effect. I would say that one of the things that we've had a very difficult time getting, particularly governments in Europe, to understand is that this thing is not just about somebody's evil thoughts in their heads. We've long since passed that stage. So, purpose is interesting, but I think that most people who face discrimination these days, and in a long, long time, it's been by facially neutral laws or policies or actions. It looks okay from the outside, but somehow winds up there are no people of color who get through that door. Oh, but I didn't mean to, hey, doesn't matter. And there is a lot of understanding and acceptance that has to be, dealt with there. Because it challenges something very deeply, as the provost said, in people's understanding of what a meritocracy is about. To say that there is a violation where you don't find someone who intended to do it. But we could talk about that later. There's a lot in there. So we've had to work very hard on getting countries to accept the full range of what the definition means and to have it in their laws. Next, we have worked hard on the question of positive measures. Positive measures are not a part of the definition. That's clearly said in the law. You call it positive measures here, or affirmative action, or you know what I'm talking about, yes. But while it's not part of the definition, it is central to address it, the violation, central. And most countries don't seem to realize that, but we can come back to that later. Then there is the question of data. It is perhaps very clear to me that if you're talking about a violation that's not based on personal animus, a bias, where you don't have to find somebody who's the evil, maker of it, then you're going to have to prove a violation in effect through data, statistical data, disaggregated data, disaggregated deeply enough so that all of the communities that might be affected, become visible. And this has been extraordinarily difficult. And I understand that some countries perhaps may not have the resources to do as deep a dive as others. But I'm not really that convinced about that, since almost every country now takes a census. That's the beginning of that. But there are also countries that swear that because of their history, because of their values, because of whatever, that they can't take a statistical, a survey of people where you get them to respond as to what they are. This is particularly prevalent in Europe. Some countries say, oh, Nazi Germany, blah, 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 et cetera. But there are plenty of, there's so much work that's been done by the UN Statistical Data Group and by also outside groups about how you do this without subjecting any individual to being identified or harmed in that. So it's, I think if one really wants to get around this, you do it. But it is also clear to me that in many, many, many cases we're dealing with, we can't put our finger on it exactly if we don't have the data. And even more, we can't fashion a remedy. We can't fashion a positive measure that is targeted to the problem if we don't know exactly what are the contours of the problem. How do we know that our positive measure is shaped correctly to meet the problem? How do we know if it's working or not? What about taking some tests to see if it's working? You can't do that if you don't have data. So the next thing that we have been working quite hard on is the criminal justice systems that are being used in almost every country around the world as a tool of state racism. We spent a lot of time focusing on issues like police profiling tactics, disproportionate numbers of racial minorities in jails or prisons. So we're still working on that. The final one that I'll mention here, and that we'll come back to, is the rights of Indigenous peoples. That every country that has Indigenous peoples, has real serious problems with respecting their rights. So this is just to give you an idea of some of the issues that have been core to our work over the past 50 years. Not to say that we have achieved 100% in terms of any of them. Not even close. But, the future work is rolling up on us. So I want to take some time to identify what we're dealing with now and in the future. There There is, of course, the persistence of racism toward persons of perceived as Muslims, talking about Islamophobia, and I'm talking about extreme measures being taken by governments in the name of national security, including, police profiling tactics, not on the streets, but also at the borders. Some pretty unpleasant things have been happening in that regard. And, I think that it is unfortunate that some governments, through fear, have made allowance for others, many others, to do that. But every country I go to, this is a prevalent practice. Islamophobia and all of its tactics, it's a prevalent practice. And then there is anti-Black racism in all of its many and varied forms, both structured and in terms of interpersonal bias. I've talked about that a little bit. And we're giving renewed focus to these issues through this UN decade on people of African descent. And we can also talk about that a little more lately. So, but we've been also tackling the emergence of some phenomena that's much, more dangerous. I call this it's three interlocking phenomena of racism, or the trifecta of racism. But the first is the rise of populist governments around the world. And it's been amazing. You had in Europe, across Europe, and then, the U.S., of course, and now down through Latin America. And it is having an incredible impact, and it is, they're holding hands around the world, and you can see this if you only look at who's visiting Trump every week. What, global leader just got elected, or hopes to get elected, as on the back of, a populist flow, and, goes to kiss the ring and to have some consultation with President Trump. The second is a global uptick in hate speech. And it's just been so alarming what's been happening around the world. I mean, people are now being, unleashed to say some of the vilest, ugly things that you could imagine. And there's permission. As people recognize that not only can you say it now, but you can run for public office, on the backs of a clearly racist platform. And you can get elected, So it's back, it's no longer passé, it's back in fashion. It's what to do now. And it's really very alarming. I had after President Trump, after the Charlottesville event, the CERD, we passed a big resolution about that, and also taking Trump down for his alliance with them on, racist hate speech. As the president of the nation, he should be saying, no, we can't do this. Instead, he said, They're good people on all sides. This is not a, so anyway, when I got back to the U.S., I was accosted by my friends at the American Civil Liberties Union, who have a pro-free speech, at any cost set of principles. And I had to say some pretty raw things to them as well. But anyway, this is all, the third piece of this is the resurgence of radical white supremacy groups across the U.S. and Europe. And it's interesting because they're all connected to each other. They all email each other. It's not just some random things popping up here and there. There's global strategy here. And they have been working on that global strategy for a while. We didn't seem to be noticing. But, now what's happened, especially with the permission to go for it in terms of hate speech, is that, as I said, the gates of hell have been opened, and these people have been unleashed again. And it's to all of our, it's very dangerous. And it really sort of, it threatens democracy at its core. So, I think it is, but it's part of this whole three thing here. Hate speech, populist governments, and white supremacists. And the white supremacists are now, emboldened enough to march down the streets of a city like Charlottesville in daylight, which they, even during Jim Crow, they only marched at night. But in daylight with no hoods on, whatever. And they own the streets now. That's their point. They don't have to hide. And all of this is playing out at the borders of the global north. As waves of migrants take incredible risk to escape the chaos that's going on in their own countries and to find a better way of life in Europe and the U.S., wherever. They're fleeing extreme poverty. They're fleeing corrupt governments. They're fleeing the effects of climate change and many other drivers of migration that are, out of their control at home. And they should be welcomed. There are places that they're going in Europe where the birth rate is so low, it's not replacing the population. So, they, people who are getting to the age of retirement, there's there are not enough people working to guarantee that their Social Security is paid. They got to be glad that there are workers coming to their countries. But what they're met with instead is horrible hate speech, racism, detentions, long-term detentions, sexual abuse, torture. Their babies are being ripped from their arms. And in countries like Libya, where the EU has paid Libya to be a sort of a closed gate, and people are stopped there. They're not supposed to go into Europe. But what happens there is that in those detention camps, people have their way with them. You know, males, black males from sub-Saharan Africa are being sold off as slaves on an auction block that's just like South Carolina. Women from Benin, young women from Benin, you know, we find bodies in the Mediterranean, 1720, of young women who have been tortured, gang raped. Others are being sold into sexual slavery. Meanwhile, in a country like Myanmar, we have to watch a Nobel Peace Prize winner standing there with folded hands as some of the most extreme aspects of racial discrimination are occurring. Genocide, you know, ethnic cleansing of 800 people in just a couple of months. It's quite a difficult world out there now. Of course, the Roma, the travelers of Europe, they are still facing intractable oppression. And indigenous peoples from Norway to South Africa to Standing Rock in the U.S., to Canada, to New Zealand, to Australia, indigenous peoples are having their land stolen wholesale. And they're suffering from other, you know, historic consequences, yes, of, conquer. But also they're facing some very new and newly devised methods to dispossess them of their rights. And finally, in every country that I have visited, I visited about 18 countries, 17, 18 countries for the UN. Every single country I visited, in every region of the world, the racial, ethnic, and religious minorities who were the targets of endemic discrimination, long term, were the poorest of the poor. I mean, either they were in jail or they were, you know, in the sort of poverty-ridden sections of, the country. There's undeniable relationship between poverty and discrimination. In fact, exclusion from the economic system is maybe the most common form of marginalization. So minorities usually are excluded from most decent work possibilities, have the lowest education outcomes, and the least access to health care. And little or no representation in the public life of the country. And certainly no involvement in decision-making about things that affect them, but also about the larger polity, as they should. So now, let's talk a little bit about the commonalities between the ILO and ICERD. And I want to talk a little bit about our methodologies. I suppose Professor ought to speak largely that I found that I didn't know very much about the ILO, even though where I sit for the UN for the last 15 years is virtually around the corner. Our methods of work are largely, similar. Our interaction with states, parties, ending in concluding observations of sorts. We have competence, at least we do at the UN, to issue general recommendations and to consider complaints from individuals if there have been domestic remedies that have been exhausted, and if those countries have signed on to the extra jurisdiction. But also, interestingly enough, we have competence to deal with the complaints rendered by one country against another for violation of CERD, something that has just come up for the first time ever. It's sort of like a provision in our treaty that this has gone unnoticed, and some smart, lawyers acting on behalf of, in this case, the state of Palestine that has laid the charge against Israel, and Qatar against two other states, has raised this as a basis for a complaint, and so it's going to be very interesting. It's going to take us a long time to get to the merits, but it's very interesting. We also have something called an urgent action. I never get this right. Urgent action. And something else I just, but anyway, it's for issues that come up very suddenly, fit under our treaty, and are, urgent. We need to do something about this right away. So it doesn't fit into the very nicely ordered timeline that we usually work in. But it allows us to do some things that other treaty bodies don't get to do because of our ability to speak outside the calendar, if you will. And that has turned out to be a very useful extra mechanism, especially with regard to Indigenous peoples and the issues that they face. So I would say that, in terms of commonalities, we probably cross on three areas primarily so far. One is the rights of Indigenous peoples, then the rights of migrants, and in particularly migrant workers, and also more recently, the questions affecting domestic workers and under the Domestic Workers Convention 189 of ILO. Thing about the migrant workers is that we're only actually getting there because of the wave of migrants coming. We've had more focus on migrants in general as non-citizens under our convention. But migrant workers has raised with us, two sets of issues. One is migrants and the other is workers. Workers under our convention, we've only had very little practice with respect to the issues of workers. Then there is, although as I can see, the ILO has taken a lot of notice of us, which is nice. I've read the new report that's just come out on racial discrimination under the ILO, and I see that in almost every case they mention CERT, which is very nice. I wish I could say back, and so do we. So, you know, where we have crossed lines, the CERT has deepened the examination based on discrimination. The ILO has a broader ambit. In that list of protected persons, there's a whole lot of other people in there that who we support, of course, but they're not under our convention. But I think that we understand discrimination more deeply, more clearly, but we don't do the workers' thing. And that's where we really can have a great amount of collaboration. Because, as I said earlier, you know, the economic marginalization is really at the core of, you know, the racist tools out there. And we have not grappled with it the way that we should have or could have, although it is covered in some respect in our treaty, in Article 5 of our treaty. But a sort of a collaboration with the ILO might give us a greater opportunity and a greater sense of competence in taking that on. We don't know anything about labor inspectorates, or, you know, we don't. And especially now that we've got the questions of how migrant workers are being treated who come across the border and who have, in certain cases, the ability to work. Are they the new cadre of exploited workers? And we should be moving on that right away. You know, I think we need to change the narrative about migration. I think that is a desperately needed point. We got to change the narrative. You know, these other guys who are populist government guys, they have one narrative on it, and it has gained support and it's gained some years. We need to change the narrative to something that is evidence-based. And I think that working between CERT and the ILO, we might be able to achieve that. Because, as your provost said, you know, people get their backs up when you talk about racism. But maybe they won't get their backs up quite as much when you say, as the ILO I said in one of the recent publications, discrimination is not only morally wrong, it also violates human rights and has negative economic consequences. And I think that the ILO is in better position to make that argument feel real. So we got to change the narrative. You can help us do that. I think we all have to be clear that, you know, we cannot dismiss what happens in other countries and the pain caused just because they're on the other side of the world. There is no other side of the world now. We are all inextricably linked, interconnected in a global society, global economy. You can't just disregard the fact that in Syria, or wherever, Libya. There are corrupt regimes. They're torturing their people. Because they're going to come here. I don't mind them coming here. But the point is that you can't dismiss them. And that this understanding has to be reflected in all that we do in terms of foreign policy and all of that. So that's very important. I think that we've got to, Professor, make sure that next time I come here, I can't say that, oh, I haven't met anybody else from the ILO. You know? There are other multilateral and specialized agencies that are there with us every session. They look at what the countries are that we're going to talk about and cover, the governments are coming before us, and they give us, in closed door, their perspective on what is happening there and what we should try to deal with. Names don't have to be used, but that's a very important thing. We have general discussions that CERT does, where we invite everybody in from all over Geneva, all the multilateral specialized agencies, et cetera, to come and talk to us about a subject. And most often, that discussion in the next session or so leads to our drafting a general recommendation. So we did a discussion of that sort on policing, practices. And we got a remarkable group of people in the room from all around the world talking about what's happening in the country and what is necessary to stop it. And that is leading to a general recommendation on policing that we hope to pass this coming session. We could do one on discrimination in labor markets. And so, between ILO and CERT, maybe we could draft a general recommendation on discrimination in labor markets. So I think there are a lot of things that can be done, that should be done. And I think that, somehow we're now getting, not only is this a terrible time for human rights, justice, racial justice, et cetera, it may be moving us closer to the nub of the point, where we can really focus on, the most important, the most critical, the most impactful, in a new way, with new understandings, and maybe new allies. So thank you very much, Professor, for causing me to do this and to come here and to learn about what you're doing here. Thank you.
So first, let me thank you most warmly for not only a thorough, informative overview of the work that CERT is doing, of its methodologies, but also really provocative reflections on where we should be going, and quite an important call in this moment, a call, frankly, that echoes, if I may say, the Director General's words in the introduction about the importance of friends in precisely these urgent moments, who are thinking carefully about these issues. And so I have noted in big, bold letters the interest in a general recommendation on racial discrimination in the labor markets. This seems exactly right. Our format is slightly different than in some of the previous sessions. What we'll do now is turn to a few pre-articulated questions around the relationship between international labor law and racial discrimination that I will ask, and then go to some questions from the plenary. So one of those really speaks to the issue of fostering policy coherence in international law. It's something that UN bodies and the ILO itself have thought about or spoken about, articulated at great length, and yet much of what you reflected for us is some degree of parallelism, but also at some level parallel tracks. And so happily receive your reflection on one channel for collaboration, which could be on a general recommendation on racial discrimination in international labor law, in international law. Also possibilities or spaces that you already have for other bodies to be involved in. And I'd want to encourage further policy suggestions on how to promote coherence, how it's done with other bodies. But let me turn to a second question, which reflects on one of the recommendations that you circulated to students, and that is general recommendation number 34, adopted by CERD in 2011, that deals specifically with racial discrimination against people of African descent. And it's such a precise and strong document in many ways, and it links the inequality that is currently experienced, including in the labor market, to its roots in transatlantic slavery, and offers a framing around areas that, frankly, I was surprised to see, including the protection of traditional knowledge, the right to prior consultation on decisions that may affect the rights of African descendants, and special discussion of the special measures, what we would tend to refer to as employment equity or educational equity measures in this context. And so I wanted to invite some of your reflections specifically on general recommendation number 34, and how you might see the ILO itself picking up on an instrument that is that specific and focused as it addresses its observations on Convention 111, but frankly on other conventions as well. Right?
Well, thank you for that. Let me say first that that general recommendation and the decade on persons of African descent are both products, in a way, out of the Durban Conference, Third World Conference against Racism, that I participated in sort of centrally, and really still think was a pivotal moment in our futures, as people of African descent, and then the world, because there were 40,000 people that came to this conference from all over the world who saw it as an opportunity that that expressed a certain optimism about the world and the future, etc. Unfortunately, the day after it closed was 9/11, which sort of robbed it of so much. But anyway, out of that, it was formed a body within the UN called the Working Group on Persons of African Descent, to sort of further elaborate on what the consequences have been for people of African descent after post-slavery, and, what the real consequences have been. Let me just stop by saying, I must say that the Declaration and the Program of Action from the Durban Conference are, to me, the most incredible documents on, racial discrimination. Much more so even than CERD, but, it's a different type.
Yeah.
But this was one of the bodies that was created, Working Group on African, People of African Descent, and they are the authors, if you will, of the decade.
Yeah.
And we, as CERD, decided that we would do this general recommendation from that point of view. And it is, I think it's rather interesting, and the decade is interesting because in the time from 2001 to now, the diaspora has grown like, a tree or whatever. And so you find people of African descent in a lot of places you would not have thought of. We just had China before us, and there were, African Chinese, I guess you'd say, who came to talk to us. But the treatment that people are facing almost everywhere rings with familiarity. And so it gives one a sense of boding, I guess, that there is really deep substance in the Afrophobia, idea. But I think that the ILO could do some very interesting things about African descendants around the world in the labor markets. And probably could do it from their own files, desk studies that sort of compile things that are already known as separate little pieces of learnings, but which paint a picture that is important.
So, thank you. My next question takes you back to Canada and your report from close to 10 years ago, which painted a powerful portrait of the working conditions of racialized people in Canada. You called, indeed, for the very language of visible minorities to be questioned, and including the disproportionate degree of poverty, poor implementation of the limited employment equity legislation and policies that exist. You pointed to the discrimination in access to employment, differential impact of non-recognition of foreign credentials on access to the job market. You wrote that consistently higher than average educational achievements for some minority communities, including African Canadian, Asian Canadian, Arab, and immigrant communities, do not translate into access to professional and skilled employment, labor mobility, and commensurate wages. And you called for the role of discrimination to be recognized. Since your report, further studies have pointed in the same direction and furthered our sense of the challenge. But let me mention that your report recommended that the abolition of the court challenges program at the time be reviewed. And I'm pleased, as a member of the current expert panel, to say that it has just come back and just started. So thank you for that work, which has been very meaningful to so many equality-seeking groups. However, the concern that you raised over the debate on reasonable accommodation, for example, of religious minorities, and in particular the targeting of Muslim community members, remains unresolved and frankly virulent. In your report, you reminded Canadians that achieving a truly inclusive society requires constant vigilance. That is a quote. And I think it would be particularly helpful participants here today to have a close sense of what kind of dialogue is fostered through that forum and other UN bodies like CERD when a report is prepared of this nature and is so careful and attuned to the specific circumstance. How does the UN, how do specialized bodies, how do the minority reporters continue to help with that constant vigilance that's needed?
Well, I think that the answer moves to what civil society and other professionals can do in countries on the ground. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, the UN has very few resources. Yeah. And so we're not able to really follow up on those. I did talk after I wrote that to a government panel at the federal level here. And I also, of course, presented it to the UN Council on Human Rights. Yes. And, you know, a room of about 1,000 people. And Canada came, you know, the diplomats came ready to respond. And, you know, I found it very interesting, this is really aside, had the really, the most, you know, anger in their response came about my charges of police profiling.
Interesting. Yeah.
And I think it came from the police themselves. I think that was in Montreal, where I met with community people, where unarmed young person had been killed, and et cetera. And the police were very disturbed that I said that I questioned the tactics that they were using. But that was the only real substantive response, but it was one that was ad hominem, in that it questioned my credentials. You know, you know, which I just thought was very unbefitting a country like Canada to address a report of that sort on that basis. But what happens at the UN is that each monitoring body, then follows up by reading the reports of all others. So when we had we reviewed Canada, you know, recently before CERD, and I do recommend to all of you to read our concluding observations. This was 2017, much more recent than mine. Yeah. But I think it's really a very good analysis. And so in doing this, we read, you know, my report and the periodic review done by governments. And that is, you know, the way we wind up following up on that, because we have very little ability to get back out into the field to do these follow-ups. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. I'll ask one last question, and I'm trying to choose which it'll be, and one is very much reflecting on your indication in your talk that there is no other side of the world in these matters, and much of the contemplation around the work on racial discrimination and the work on international labor law is siloed, in that it assumes that the best, most appropriate space for addressing these issues is the national space. And then the monitoring mechanisms are structured in that way. And yet, we know not only of the transnational nature of the kinds of challenges that you address to us, migration, of course, most immediately comes to mind, but the thinking about how we understand racial exclusion itself stems from a deep understanding of the transnational, whether you root it in slavery or colonialism, or you think about how ideas continue to travel. And so I wonder, given the extent of your own transnational work and your work on apartheid, what your reflections might be about how we join this understanding that there is no other side of the world with the way that we then engage with the conventions, the treaty bodies, and exchange.
Well, I think that you put your finger on it, that the everything in the UN human rights structures flows back to the national level. We're going to critique what you're doing, et cetera, but then we're going to, feed it into your government and hope that you do the right thing. Of course, we will accept the comments of civil society and that sort of thing, but in a significant measure, there's no crossing of the silos. So Mexico has no idea what you all are doing here. And really should, actually.
Yeah, especially regional.
So there's just no bodies for that. There used to be, before the reform of the UN, a time when the Human Rights Commission, which is what it was called then, met at one time in Geneva over 6 weeks and covered all of the issues from all of the countries. And I thought it was marvelous because also all of the NGOs from all over the world came. We all got to talk to each other and to learn from each other, et cetera. So I think it's really a significant point, and how you would change that structurally in the UN, I think, is an interesting thing to contemplate. I'll just tell you this. I don't know what everybody knows about the Sustainable Development Goals and that whole process. Well, I got a grant to sit in on the negotiations for Sustainable Development Goals. And I had a very narrow mandate, and that was to make sure that they applied to minorities.
Right.
But what I learned there, now they were all negotiated in New York, the UN in New York. We're from Geneva. That's a different UN. And, we think that we have won certain battles, that we have made it clear that you can't discriminate against women, that you don't say certain things. And it's, okay, so I get to New York, and this discussion is as if they never heard of any of that. And so it becomes clear to me that what's going to come out of there, which will apply to all nations, will be something that is, I won't use the word retrograde, but it's not going to reflect the full understandings that we have come to on human rights. And so I think, when they were ready to deal with the question of reforming the UN, I was asked to give my views in one of the panels. I said, I thought that the most important thing that should be done is to move the Geneva agencies to New York, so that the people, the diplomats who hear about women's roles in peacekeeping are the people who are deciding about peacekeeping. You know, we're talking to different people here. Who knows if they ever, tell their colleagues in New York. But one thing is for sure is that the people who are deciding life and death and development issues and all of that are not who we know in Geneva. They don't know anything about labor issues. They don't know anything about human rights. It's a major flaw, I would say, in the system.
Yeah.
So I think it's very critical to find a way to make that connection across lines, for the issues that we care about and for many others as well.
Yeah, well, sobering. I'd like to open it up to our audience, and what I will do is collect a few questions and then come back to Gay McDougall. So, to start us off, surprisingly, you did.
So, first of all, thank you for your presentation. I have to say that for personal family reasons, I could not get the person who usually scans things to get it scanned. However, I listened to your talk, and you said at some point that we have to change the narrative and to show how discrimination is not only morally wrong, it's not only legally wrong, but it's also economically wrong. So let's make the parallel. I'll make a parallel between two situations. The first situation has to do with Indigenous people here in Canada. And I'm sure you've heard about it. It's the case that Cindy Blackstock has advocated for years now. And it's essentially a completely facially neutral policy of allocating welfare as well as other resources, basic social assistance resources to children on the basis of the size of the community. And since reserves are mostly small, then there's less allocation, and this has been deemed to be discriminatory. But then we see that in that specific context, a perfectly rational economic measure from the point of view of liberal capitalism ends up being discriminatory. And the battle is not over because there's been a victory in the tribunal, and yet there's been ongoing fights for implementing that victory because the government doesn't want to implement it. First example. Second example, there's in the election of Quebec last October, there's been this thing called in French pénurie de la main-d'œuvre. I guess the best way to translate it is labor shortage.
Labor shortage.
Yeah, and so of course there's this party who's now in power that seems to be the party that wants to stop immigration and so on, and it said no, there's no labor shortage. But the party that was that was against it and advocated a seemingly liberal defense of minorities kept saying, yeah, there's labor shortage, and we all know that in fact he was advocating more immigration to address it, because the best way to depress wages is to increase the demand of laborers. The more supply of laborers there is, the less the wages will be high, and the less the supply of laborers will be, the greater the demand for labor, and the higher the wages. So what he should have said is not a labor shortage, it's a cheap labor shortage. So what we see now is that there's this intricate link between market mechanisms and the continuing of discriminatory outcomes. And so I want to ask you, is it not time to basically go further and change the narrative and talk of populist governments? I could go forever about the link between neoliberalism and the rise of populism all over the world. I won't do it. Should we not frankly admit that neoliberalism is one of the most basic causes of systemic racism all over the world? And should we not say that neoliberalism is the most racist economic system ever imaginable and needs to be supplanted?
Well, can I just, I just say this very quickly. Some of my friends say that. Okay, next.
Julia.
Thank you very much for your talk. Just picking up on 2 points made both by you and Professor Blackett. One was that, there's no other side of the world, and this issue of the perception that labor issues are best dealt with domestically. I just wanted to ask you a question on the recent, revelations of not only racial discrimination, but racial harassment, if you want to say repression, in the American UPS factory. There is, over several years, there was instances of those types of behaviors, I think even including a noose being placed over an African American's work area. So my question really is there any role for your committee to play, perhaps not in addressing it, but at least in commenting on these sorts of conduct that occur internationally?
My question is more centered on Montreal and Quebec. What's interesting in our province is that Montreal is bilingual, multicultural, very dynamic city, but we're in a province that has become populist. So the identity of what it means to be a Montrealer is very different than that of Quebec at large.
Hey, I live in New York.
Yes. So exactly, in the state of New York, the rural state is going to be very different than the New York City, and that applies to many countries and many provinces, many states. So does the UN have any mechanisms or programs that assists cities such as Montreal who want to become more independent from our province? And we are advancing mechanisms to remedy systemic discrimination by having public consultations, by mobilizing, but there's a disconnection between Montrealers and the legislator at the provincial level. So when we do advance issues at the municipal level, are there relationships, connections, or mechanisms or resources that the UN has to support cities like Montreal, and I'm sure a lot of other cities around the world who have multicultural makeups, who are countering the rise of populism at the country or state or provincial level?
I want to thank you first for your very presentation, and I know that you have or have had a very special relationship with South Africa, and my question will bring us back there with specific reference to the issue of land ownership.
Can you speak up a little bit?
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm saying my question will bring us back to South Africa with specific reference to the issue of land ownership or the spatial or geographical occupation of land that has deep impact on labor rights and working conditions. So my question is, what are your reflections on how should the CRD respond to systemic discrimination that is epitomized by or embedded upon previous or still existing institutional framework that alienates racialized population?
So first of all, thank you so much for your work with minorities around the world. I think that it's appreciated from just a lot of people here. My question regards your comment about the right-wing populist governments, how they've been collaborating and how there is a global strategy that you mentioned for right-wing governments around the world. I wanted to ask you if you could elaborate on how to combat that strategy and also what that strategy is in concrete terms as well. It brought to mind, for example, Monk debate commentator Steve Bannon, how he's been behind the rise of, I guess, Trump and the Brazilian Prime Minister. And so this network of right-wing populist government, I guess, strategists is very alive and very active. Just if you could comment on how that developed, what you can do to combat it, and what's that about?
We'll add one last question to this healthy list.
I have a bit of a different question. Like Professor Blackett, I was really interested in General Recommendation 34, specifically the right for people of African descent to the protection of their traditional knowledge and their cultural and artistic heritage. And it made me think about stolen African artifacts in museums around the world? And do you think that this convention can be used as a basis of an argument to reclaim cultural and artistic heritage, reclaim stolen African artifacts, and put them back in their rightful places and rightful countries?
So this discussion has elicited quite a range of possible areas for reflection. I'm tempted, this is terrible of me, but I'm tempted just to ask one last question. Just because, coming back to the UN and the ILO, structures premised, again, on national representation, they've done a lot to foreground gender as transversal. And so my question, predictably, is what about race? Is there a way? So now I'm thinking really about representation within UN structures. They've, of course, got a structure so that they've got representation by nationality, right, in there. But are we at a place, if we're talking underrepresentation, where we might need to be thinking about what, just like, you know, the diversity in cities, we should be thinking about how in the conversations in New York, just as the conversations in Geneva, we've put the representation of national minorities squarely as an issue that should be considered within. So there we go. A lot of questions, which is at very least an indication of the tremendous interest.
Okay, are you going to refresh my memory or restate them? That's okay. Well, first of all, the UPS factories.
Yeah.
Who asked me that?
Julia over here.
Julia,
Yeah.
sorry.
Yeah, no,
I knew I was
and
looking in the
thought
wrong
this,
direction. You know, it's not just the UPS factory. I could name you 10 similar examples. Some police stations, you know, that, you know, are filing suit because their, you know, co-workers hung nooses in their lockers and stuff. You know, I think that, first of all, this is an example of how hate speech has gotten, you know, is no longer as passé as it was once for a hot minute. Yes, we would say something about that. Under our urgent action and early warning, you know, it just takes somebody sending us a note. Can't you say something about this? You know, to engage our, you know, jurisdiction, and we would, if it, in general, falls within the mandate of our convention, as those kinds of incidents do.
And next was Balarama on cities.
No,
So-
I think it was him.
Oh, and
Is
Thierry,
that-
yeah, Thierry asked about, it doesn't matter.
Okay,
Thierry asked about land and labor.
Land
Yeah.
and labor.
Yeah.
Okay. It's, you know, I think it is having, you know, spent a significant part of my life and career on South Africa. I've been very disappointed in the lack of progress on dismantling the structures of apartheid. Land ownership, one, and you know, certainly employment. Although I have a deeper understanding of what happened on the employment question. But some of this comes out of the terms of the negotiated settlement, which were somewhat based, first of all, on Lancaster House and the Zimbabwe thing, which, you know, these are negotiated settlements. You know, nobody marched into Pretoria and shot dead the, you know, so somehow the two sides had to come to an agreement. And one of the formulas that was developed at Lancaster House was that there would be no disruptions, let's say, of economic situations. Now that was said neutrally, but it meant everything from you can't take anybody's land away to you can't fire anybody in the civil service. So for many, for a long time, in Zimbabwe, as you may know, they had a dual civil service. A country that had no money, but they could not fire or displace or reassign or change the terms in any way because of this. So to say it briefly, they were willing to give the the black population civil and political rights as long as their economic rights were not touched. The other thing that I think, South Africa caused a lot of nervousness in South Africa was what happened in Zimbabwe. In other words, that the sense that too quickly, President Mugabe started divesting white farmers of their land. And it caused something of a panic, which had negative impacts. Now, we're not quite sure what negative impacts it had, because Mugabe had his own bag of negative impacts. But so as the next country was Namibia, and same deal, and then South Africa, more or less the same deal. The other thing is that, as these were being negotiated, you had the World Bank, and you had the the WTO and whoever standing outside the room saying, if you do this, you all get the country, but we're not going to give you any loans. We're not going to give you, So there were other pressures as well. I think it is truly a tragedy that South Africa did not get the capacities, the capabilities to do more. I mean, here's a government that has the most progressive constitution in the world. Has economic, social, cultural rights in the Constitution, and has had a wonderful judiciary. And the Constitutional Court has tried to use these, progressive terms, but they can't, they can't direct anybody, away from the economic resources that they have in order to do much. There was a very positive decision made on HIV/AIDS treatment, but it wasn't one that had to move major resources from private hands to public. Just reordered the bureaucracy. So it's, I say you only get one chance to redo a country. But, it's been sad. What was the next one? Something about network of right-wing populists. Oh, you.
Yeah.
And you wanted to know if I could tell you what they're planning? Hey, I wouldn't be sitting here if I could do that. I think that they have been planning to take back the world. I think that there's been a decision that our side has been winning too many. And they're going to take back the world. In the U.S., I think, and a lot of people agree with this, that, this is the pendulum swing from having a black president. And maybe similar in other parts of the world. Because Latin America was doing pretty good for a while, and was focusing on the right issues, poverty alleviation. I mean, in Brazil, they had lifted all of these people out of poverty by what? Giving them money, But now, that's all pushed back. So I'm not sure I can say much more than that. The stolen artifacts, that's an interesting point. Yes.
Yes.
The, maybe. I mean, of course, there's this movement already. In Senegal, France is giving them back all of the art stolen from colonial days. They built a beautiful new museum in Senegal to house it. And there are all sorts of collaborations that will be going on in order to transfer knowledge about how you, maintain and all of that. So maybe you can. Where are you from? Where are you going to get stuff back to? We'll talk afterwards.
About the urban question?
Yeah,
Montreal?
this was your question, right?
Yeah, that's my question.
And what was it?
Oh, so just whether we can think about race across. We've made some movement beyond the national appointments. Can we do it we've done it in gender, can we do it for race?
Well, I'm not sure we've done it for gender.
Well, it's
not in the UN, but
it's on the table as a discussion.
it's on the table. But I think that it is, and in fact, I think I might have been thinking about this last night. I think the ILO structure is one that's interesting because it has at the table, fully credentialed
Yes.
individuals that are not representing a nation state.
Yeah.
Then you have the Permanent Forum on the rights of Indigenous peoples in New York, which is the same thing. You've got, I think that those are the only, maybe, two, examples I could think of in the UN where that has been done. I think it's very important because the one thing I've learned about the UN is that nothing moves without the engine of civil society.
Yeah.
And, that's more or less true comment on every and all governments. So if you could think of a formula, I would really be willing to push it with you because I think that there is some, at least for women, you've got UN Women.
Yeah.
But UN Women is different. It's an agency. It's not a seat at the table.
That's right.
So, yeah.
I'm with you. So this has just been remarkable. And to convey our words of profound thanks, I'll turn to the Labor Law and Development Research Laboratory Scientific Coordinator, Emily Painter.
Yes, so on behalf of the Labor Law and Development Research Lab, the Trudeau Foundation, and the Faculty of Law at McGill University, I'd like to extend our sincerest thank yous to our extraordinary guest today on this International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. I don't think I can begin to thank you appropriately for your presence today, for your truly remarkable work, and for sharing your reflections on how best to address racial discrimination in the workplace. But as a small token of our immense appreciation,
I'd like to get this here. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So we'll pause now for a 15-minute break. There's coffee, refreshments outside. Please help yourselves. Then registered students in the course will reconvene for our final session. So thank you to all for coming out.